In March of 415 AD, in the city of Alexandria, a woman was pulled from her carriage by a mob, dragged into a church, and killed. She was, by the accounts that survive her, the most prominent mathematician and philosopher in the Mediterranean world. She had taught astronomy and mathematics and Neoplatonic philosophy to students who came from across the Roman Empire to sit in her lecture hall. She had advised the Roman Prefect of Egypt on matters of governance and philosophy. She had corresponded with bishops and governors and intellectuals across the empire. She had done all of this as a woman, in a world that had not designed a place for women who did what she did, and she had done it without apology, without concealment, and without the permission of any institution that might have been in a position to grant it. The mob that killed her was directed, most historians believe, by the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, who would later be canonized as a saint. The charge against her, if there was a formal charge, was paganism. The real offense was something harder to name. She represented, in her person and in her practice, a way of knowing the world through reason, through mathematics, through the disciplined investigation of what could be demonstrated and proven, that was becoming, in the 5th century AD, the wrong kind of knowing, the kind that did not require a church's authority, the kind that did not need permission to be true. She was approximately 60 years old. She had spent her entire adult life in Alexandria's great intellectual tradition, the tradition of Euclid and Eratosthenes and Ptolemy and Plotinus, the tradition that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world for 7 centuries. And she was the last major figure in that tradition. After her death, the scholars scattered, the libraries were ransacked, the ancient conversation, the extraordinary 7th-century conversation between mathematics and philosophy and science and the examined life, went quiet for a very long time. She was the last of something. What she was the last of matters enormously, and what she died for is still being decided. There is a particular kind of pressure that most thoughtful people in midlife have learned to manage, and that they have learned, for the most part, not to call by its real name. The pressure to know things in the approved way, to arrive at conclusions through the approved channels, to hold opinions that are sanctioned by the institution, the profession, the ideological tribe, the social world that provides the belonging that a person needs to function. The pressure that arrives not as a command, nobody issues the command formally, but as the ambient, persistent, entirely effective atmosphere of a world that knows how to make independent thinking expensive. The professional context where the genuinely examined position, the one you arrived at through actual thinking, through the kind of sustained, honest, sometimes uncomfortable inquiry that Hypatia practiced and taught, does not match what the institution needs you to believe. The social world where the opinion that follows from looking carefully at the evidence is the wrong opinion for the group. The culture that celebrates the appearance of critical thinking while systematically rewarding the thinking that confirms what the culture already knows. Hypatia did not face a version of this. She faced the original. The mob in the street was the 5th century's version of what every age produces in its own form. The organized, socially sanctioned violence against the person who insists on knowing things in the way that knowing things actually requires, rather than in the way that the dominant institution has decided knowing things should go. She is not a distant figure from a distant world. She is the sharpest possible point of a question that is still open. What does it cost to think without permission, and what does it cost not to?
Hypatia was born in Alexandria around 355 AD, the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer who was himself a significant figure in the intellectual tradition of the city. Theon made a decision that was, for the time, extraordinary. He would educate his daughter the same way he would have educated a son, in mathematics, in astronomy, in the philosophical tradition that ran from Plato through Plotinus, in the full rigor of the ancient intellectual inheritance. She surpassed him, not in the way that biographical legends make convenient, not suddenly, not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation, in the slow, steady, unambiguous way of a person for whom the intellectual life was not an achievement to be demonstrated, but a practice to be deepened. She edited and extended her father's commentaries on mathematical texts. She wrote commentaries of her own on Apollonius and Diophantus and Ptolemy, technical works in mathematics and astronomy that demonstrated mastery not just of the tradition, but of its edges, the places where it could be pushed further. And she taught. This is what the sources emphasize most consistently across the centuries of accounts that survive. She taught with an authority and a clarity that drew students from across the empire, pagans and Christians alike, young men from wealthy families who could have studied anywhere and chose to come to Alexandria because Hypatia was there. Her most famous student was Cyneas of Cyrene, who became a bishop and whose letters to her survive, letters addressed to her as his teacher, full of philosophical questions and personal affection, written by a Christian bishop to a pagan philosopher, with no apparent sense that this was unusual. She moved through the public world of Alexandria with a freedom that was, by the standards of the time, remarkable. She wore the tribon, the philosopher's cloak. She rode through the city in her carriage. She lectured in public. She met with the Roman prefect, Orestes, on political and philosophical matters, advising him with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard not through birth or appointment, but by the quality of her thinking. This last relationship, her close association with Orestes, became dangerous when Alexandria's new bishop, Cyril, began his campaign to consolidate ecclesiastical power over the city. Orestes resisted Cyril's ambitions. Hypatia, as Orestes' advisor and as the visible symbol of the city's older intellectual tradition, became a target. A rumor circulated, Socrates Scholasticus records it as a rumor, that she was using magic to bewitch Orestes against the church. It was not magic they were afraid of. It was the specific, visible, thoroughly demonstrated authority of a person whose knowing did not depend on the church's authorization. In a city and a century where the question of who had the right to know things, who had the authority to interpret the world, was being decided by force, Hypatia represented the wrong answer. She represented the tradition that said the right to know things comes from the quality of your thinking, not from the institution that sanctions your conclusions. The mob, called the Parabolani, nominally a group of Christian hospital workers who had been weaponized as Cyril's enforcers, found her in the street in March of 1415. They dragged her to the Caesareum church. What happened there is recorded in the ancient sources in terms too brutal to dwell on. She was killed. Her body was burned. Her library was destroyed. She was the last major philosopher of the Alexandrian school. After her, the tradition dispersed. Some of her students went to Athens, where the Platonic Academy continued for another century, until Justinian closed it in 529. Others scattered. The living thread of the ancient conversation, the thread that connected Euclid to Ptolemy to Hypatia, the thread of people who had been handing the mathematical and philosophical inheritance of the ancient world from teacher to student for 7 centuries, was cut. It took roughly 1,000 years to pick it back up. What Hypatia died for is not, in the end, a simple thing to name. It has been named in many ways, as a martyr for paganism, as a martyr for science, as a symbol of what religious fanaticism destroys, as an early feminist icon, as a figure in the story of the conflict between reason and faith.
All of these framings contain something true. None of them contains the whole truth. The whole truth is more specific and more personally demanding than any of them. It is this: Hypatia practiced and embodied and died for a particular relationship to knowing. The relationship that says truth is arrived at through the quality of the inquiry, not through the authority of the institution that sanctions the conclusion. That the person who has done the work, who has sat with the problem long enough, thought carefully enough, followed the argument wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination is convenient, has earned a kind of epistemic authority that no institution can grant and no mob can take away, though a mob can certainly kill the person who holds it. This is what Theon gave his daughter when he educated her, as he would have educated a son. Not a set of conclusions, a practice. The practice of knowing for yourself, through mathematics, through philosophy, through the disciplined investigation of what can be demonstrated, that produces a relationship to truth that is independent of approval, independent of institutional sanction, independent of the social cost of being right when the wrong people need you to be wrong. She held that relationship her entire life. She held it when it was celebrated, when Synesius wrote to her as his teacher, when Orestes sought her counsel. She held it when it became dangerous, when Cyril's campaign made her association with Orestes a liability, when the rumor about magic circulated in the street. She did not recant, she did not moderate, she did not perform the accommodation that might have saved her. Not from stubbornness, from the specific, philosophically grounded conviction that the thing she was refusing to surrender, the right to know things in the way that knowing things actually requires, was worth more than the safety of surrendering it. That a life of knowing in the approved way, arriving at approved conclusions through approved channels, was not the life of a philosopher. It was not the life she had been given, and it was not the life she was prepared to trade her own for. Now, the bridge. Because Hypatia was a 5th century Alexandrian mathematician living at the end of the ancient world, and most of the people watching this video are not navigating 5th century religious politics in an Egyptian city. But here is what has not changed in 1600 years. The pressure to know things in the approved way is not a feature of any particular regime or religion or century. It is a feature of institutions, of organized social life, of any world in which belonging to the group depends in part on arriving at the group's conclusions, and in which the person who has done the honest work, who has sat with the problem long enough, thought carefully enough, followed the argument wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination is convenient, has earned a kind of epistemic authority that no institution can grant and no mob can take away, though a mob can certainly kill the person who holds it. The cost today is not the mob in the street. For most people reading this, it is something quieter and more corrosive. The professional opinion that would cost you the relationship with the senior person if you said it clearly. The honest assessment that would make you unwelcome in the community if you named it. The conclusion you have arrived at through careful thinking that you carry privately, that you do not say in the meeting, that you have become skilled at managing because saying it clearly in the room where it would matter carries a cost that Hypatia paid and that you have decided sensibly and understandably is too high. She is not asking you to pay that cost. She is asking you to see it, to know the name of what you are doing when you manage the knowledge you have earned, to understand the difference between the prudent, practical judgment that this is not the moment, and the slow, cumulative identity-eroding pattern of a person who has stopped trusting their own knowing because the world has made the trusting expensive.
Here is what Hypatia of Alexandria asks of you, practically, today. First, take the inventory of what you know that you are not saying. Not the trivial opinion, the substantive knowing, the conclusion you have arrived at through careful thinking, through years of experience, through the kind of sustained and honest inquiry that earns the right to be heard, the professional assessment that the room needs but that the room has not asked for, the honest evaluation of a situation that everyone around you is managing rather than addressing, the thing you know, clearly and without genuine doubt, that you are keeping private because saying it clearly would cost something you have decided you cannot afford to pay. Write it down.
not to publish it, to know that you know it, because the first cost of the managed knowing is not the external one, not the professional consequence, not the social friction. It is the internal cost, the gradual, barely perceptible erosion of trust in your own thinking that happens when you repeatedly know things and then manage the knowing rather than act on it. Second, distinguish prudence from capitulation. Hypatia was not reckless. She was a philosopher in the full ancient sense, a person who thought carefully about everything, including the circumstances of her own life and the realistic consequences of her choices. The ancient philosophical tradition she represented did not celebrate martyrdom for its own sake. It celebrated the examined life, the life in which the choices are made consciously, with clear eyes, for reasons the person has actually thought through. There is a genuine difference between the prudent judgment that this is not the moment to say the hard thing, that the relationship is not established enough, that the stakes are not high enough, that a better moment will come, and the pattern of permanent deferral, in which the better moment never comes and the hard thing is never said, and the knowing is managed indefinitely, until the person doing the managing has forgotten what they knew. Hypatia would ask you to know the difference, to examine honestly and without the comfortable self-deception that prudence can cover for, which one you were doing, and to notice whether the prudence has calcified into something else, into the habit of a person who has learned to override their own knowing so consistently that the overriding has become invisible. Third, practice knowing out loud. One of the things Hypatia did that made her dangerous was visible. She did not keep her philosophy private. She lectured in public, in the philosopher's cloak, in a city that could see her and draw conclusions. She made her knowing visible, not as performance, not as provocation, but as the ordinary expression of a person for whom the intellectual life was not a private hobby, but a public practice.
Find one place, one conversation, one relationship, one professional context where you say the thing you know. Not everything, not the full inventory of managed knowledge. One thing, said clearly in the form that your honest thinking has produced, rather than the form that the room's comfort requires. And notice what happens, not to the room, not to the relationship, but to you, to the specific quality of aliveness that comes from acting on what you know, rather than managing it. Fourth, protect the practice of thinking for yourself. Hypatia's deepest legacy is not the specific conclusion she reached. Most of her written work has not survived. It is the practice, the embodied, publicly demonstrated, entirely serious practice of a person who treated the independent examination of questions as the highest and most necessary form of human activity, who showed by how she lived what it looked like to know things in the way that knowing things actually requires. Protect that practice in your own life, not heroically, daily. The hour of reading that is not in service of any position you already hold, the conversation in which you genuinely try to understand the argument you disagree with rather than defeat it, the question you sit with long enough that the answer surprises you, the willingness which Hypatia paid for with her life to follow the thinking wherever it actually leads, rather than to the destination that the institution or the tribe or the social world has already decided is the right one. That is the practice, not martyrdom, not the grand, unrepeatable gesture of a philosopher who would not recant. The daily, unglamorous, entirely available practice of thinking for yourself, which is what she did every day of her life before the day she died for it. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Hypatia. Not the mob, not the death, not the dramatic, irreversible moment of historical violence that has made her a symbol. The lecture hall. The students who had come from across the empire to sit in her classroom, Christian and pagan, rich and poor by the standards of their century, drawn by something that transcended the categories that were already in Alexandria in 400 AD, beginning to harden into the categories that would kill her. The mathematician in the philosopher's cloak, standing before them, asking the question that mathematics and philosophy and the examined life have always asked. What is actually true? Not what does the institution say is true,
Not what does the tradition require you to believe is true. Not what is it safe and convenient and professionally wise to call true. What is actually demonstrably arrived at through honest inquiry true?
She asked that question her entire life. She asked it until the asking became dangerous. She asked it until the danger became lethal. And she did not stop asking, not because she was unaware of the danger, but because she had understood from the practice of a lifetime that the question was not something a philosopher could stop asking and remain a philosopher. The lecture hall is gone. The library is gone. The ancient conversation she was the last custodian of went quiet for 1,000 years. But the question is still open. It has always been open. It is open right now, in whatever room you are in whatever form the pressure to know things in the approved way is currently taking in your life. What do you actually think? Not what the institution needs you to think, not what the tribe requires, not what the approval of the people whose approval you need demands. What, having looked carefully, thought honestly, and followed the argument wherever it leads, do you actually know? Here is the question Hypatia of Alexandria leaves us with today. Not from the lecture hall, not from the ancient tradition she carried and the mob that ended her carrying of it, from the practice, from the specific, daily, entirely personal practice of a person who refused, for 60 years, to know things in the way that required someone else's permission. What are you managing instead of saying? What are you keeping private instead of acting on? What do you know, clearly, carefully, through the quality of your own thinking that the world around you has made expensive to know? And what is it costing you, every day you manage it, to carry the knowing without the saying? Leave that in the comments, because naming what you know is the beginning of the practice that Hypatia spent her life embodying, not the martyrdom, the daily, unglamorous, entirely available act of a person who trusts their own thinking enough to let it be visible. I'll see you in the next one.